For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm James Yoder. I'm the president of UK's Federalist Society. Today we're very pleased to welcome Professor Josh Blackman of Houston College of Law. Josh not only teaches constitutional law, but also is the founder of Fantasy SCOTUS, the premier internet fantasy for the Supreme Court of the U.S.
Go sign up, guys. Go sign up.
He's also the founder and president of the Harlan Institute. And today, Professor Blackman will be addressing the Supreme Court, how the empty seat vacated by the untimely passing of Justice Scalia is affecting the pending cases, and how the election on Tuesday will affect all of this. Commentary will be provided by our own Joshua Douglas, who you all know. And without further ado, please welcome Professor Josh Blackman.
Thank you all so much. Thank you so much. By the way, you were promised Chick-fil-A, and you will get Chick-fil-A. I've been informed it's underway, so what happens, I'll speak for a bit. When I'm done, you'll get your chicken, and then Professor Douglas will tell me why I'm wrong. So it's very fitting that I'm here today with my good friends, Professor Salamanca, Professor Fry at Kentucky Law School, to talk about the Supreme Court and the election. Why? Because the room we're in is actually named after Mitch McConnell, who is playing a very central role in the current debate over the Supreme Court vacancy. So what I'd like to do today is talk about, while I still can, what would a Trump Supreme Court look like? What would a Clinton Supreme Court look like? And how has Justice Scalia's vacancy affected precedents both in the short term and in the long term? And Professor Douglas, who had several commitments today, will provide some responses specific to election law and redistricting law. So first, I like to talk about how the justices themselves have viewed the Supreme Court process. During the final presidential debate in Las Vegas a few weeks ago, President Clinton was asked, I'm sorry, getting ahead of myself, Secretary Clinton, see where I'm going with this. Secretary Clinton was asked, what would you look for in a justice? And her answer, which stretched nearly 2 minutes, omitted one very important word: the Constitution. Indeed, the Constitution had absolutely nothing to do with her vision of the Supreme Court. She said, I feel strongly that the Supreme Court needs to stand on the side of the American people, not on the side of the powerful corporation, the wealthy, right? It's important that we do not reverse marriage equality. We do not reverse Roe v. Wade. We stand Citizens United. And once again, there's a great tradition of standing up to the powerful and standing up. So this was the talk point, right? Standing up for the powerful. This is a term without much meaning. In some places, the law favors the powerful. In some places, it favors the powerless. But this is purely an outcome-driven view of the Constitution, right? Whatever helps the little guy, we do. And if it's helping the big guy, we won't. Okay, again, no mention of the actual Constitution itself. Trump had a very different answer, one that I probably could never have fathomed some time ago. He said, we need to appoint judges to uphold the Second Amendment, which is under absolute siege. We need to appoint pro-life judges, not due process, pro-life justices. Not sure why that's relevant. They will have a conservative bent, whatever that means. They'll be protecting the Second Amendment. They're great scholars in all cases, and they're people of tremendous respect. Now, here's a key part, Trump said. They will interpret the Constitution the way the founders wanted it interpreted. And I believe that's very important. Now, if you had asked me a year ago, will Trump be an originalist? It is insane. But you actually have Donald Trump, whether he means it or not, or understands it or not, articulating originalism. Good. Indeed, he did put forward this list of now nearly 20 judges, in a lot of swing states in particular, that he would put in the court. And I think what's remarkable at this list is that these are all appellate judges who have expressed some faith in textualism, some faith in originalism. And many of them are state judges who will have a profound respect for federalism. So as much as I have knocked on Mr. Trump, and I am not a fan of his, I think he's done actually a great public service by announcing in advance names that we can scrutinize them, right? Hillary has not announced any names. Indeed, she's been very coy, saying she will appoint judges who will reverse Citizens United, who will do this, who will do that, but no names. The problem with these litmus tests, of course, is once a judge says, I will reverse Citizens United, that judge must be recused. See, there's an ethical dimension to these litmus tests. Because once a judge announces, I will vote X or I will vote Y, they got to sit the case out. So I think Clinton's litmus tests are somewhat problematic. But none of this matters in the meantime until we think about the Senate. And that's why I said it's fitting we're in a room named after Majority Leader McConnell. Shortly after Justice Scalia's death, within literally minutes, the Republicans coalesced in a strategy of saying, we will not confirm anyone until after the election, right? It didn't matter who Barack Obama picked. Maybe if they call for the Supreme Court, maybe they view it differently. But no matter who they picked, they were not going to move the nomination. And indeed, Barack Obama nominated Merrick Garland, a D.C. Circuit judge, for the Supreme Court. And he's now been pending for nearly 3-4 months. I've lost count. It's the longest pending judicial nomination, not the longest vacancy. The longest vacancy was President Tyler, I think. It was like a 2-year vacancy where basically the Senate said, we don't want to confirm anyone for you. So the seat stayed open for like 2 years. So it's not the longest vacancy, but I think it's the longest pending nomination. Brandeis was the longest. His was held up because he was a progressive and a Jew. Garland is for different reasons. Okay. So will the next president actually be able to nominate a justice? A couple of things to think about there. First, in the event that you have a Clinton presidency and a Democrat Senate, that is Majority Leader Schumer, at that point, you still have what's called the filibuster, right? That the Republicans could filibuster Garland or filibuster whomever. That filibuster, my friends, is not long for this world. There's something called the nuclear option, which by a simple majority vote, the Senate can remove the filibuster for the nomination of Supreme Court justices. They've already removed the filibuster for nominating of lower court judges, but still in place for the Supreme Court. Tim Kaine, who's the VP nominee for the Dems, has said we will nuke, right? We will use the nuclear option and get rid of the filibusters. That way, Majority Leader Schumer could confirm a justice with 51 votes, which is not very good news for Mr. Garland. Mr. Garland, the so-called nominee moderate consensus. If they get rid of the 60-vote block, you don't need a moderate. You can go hard left. Not that it really makes any difference. And I have to make this point clearly. Justice Breyer and Justice Ginsburg, when it counts, vote the same way. In 5-4 cases, they vote 80% the same way. I don't think there'll be much of a difference between Garland and Goodwin Liu. Maybe there'll be more of a rhetorical flourish, but when the votes count, they'll be there. But in the event that it's a Democrat White House and a Democrat Senate, nothing's going to happen, right? They're going to nuke the filibuster, and they'll confirm someone. Where it gets interesting is if there's a President Clinton and the namesake of this room, McConnell, still the majority leader. What happens then? Well, the first thing to know is you still have the filibuster rule in place. And it's entirely conceivable, even if the Republicans hold a hearing for Judge Garland, that Republicans filibuster him. And let's say Ted Cruz files a motion for cloture and says, unless Garland gets to 60 votes, we won't move forward. He may not get to 60 votes if the Democrats only have a 53, 54 vote majority in the Senate. Republicans may hold tight, in which case no one's confirmed. Or they bring him up for a floor vote and the guy gets voted down, doesn't get the 60 votes period, so he's rejected. So I think it's under very slight circumstances that Judge Garland actually gets confirmed. I think it's very slight. It's possible, but who the hell knows, right? So I'm always wrong about these things anyway. So you'll come back. I can do this now before the election, make all these wild predictions. You'll never remember if I'm wrong, but if I'm right, you will remember. That's the beauty of being a professor. It's true. So in the event that they actually bring Garland up for a hearing, he may get voted down, or they may simply say no hearing, period. That he's too liberal, and we don't want him. Now you may say, wait a minute, Josh. Weren't the Republicans saying all along, we'll wait for the outcome of the election? That was never the real position, right? The position wasn't we want to wait till the election. The position was whoever Obama picks is not going to be conservative, Justice Scalia. And we should be honest about that, right? The reason why they're blocking Garland is because he's not as conservative as Scalia, not even by a mile. So the Republicans might say, okay, we'll give you someone else. There's actually an idea I'm toying with, and I'll test it out on all of you. The Constitution speaks of advice and consent. Advice and consent. All they do now is consent, say yes or no. They're not giving much advice. They don't give much advice at all. My suggestion would actually be the Senate votes on several names, one at a time, and provides those votes to the president. Like, here's our advice. We have these people, these people. Let the majority leader get some names, and let the minority leader get some names. And this is actually their advice. And the president knows, well, this guy's got 60 votes, and she's got 40 votes. Well, maybe I can pick one or the other. This might be breaking the logjam. I say advice before consent. We actually follow the Constitution's text and the order. But that's what happens if we have this sort of divided government with a Democratic president and a Republican Senate. Now let's do the flip side, right? The flip side is what happens. What happens if Trump wins the election? If Trump wins the election and you have a Republican majority in Congress, the same thing will happen in reverse. Democrats will filibuster whomever Trump nominates, at which point Mitch McConnell will stand up and say, you know what, we need to eliminate the filibuster because Democrats are being intransigent. It'll be a mirror image. Okay, so whoever is the next president, if the Senate is of the same party, they're getting confirmed. And what happens if you have a Trump presidency and a Democrat Senate? You can be pretty damn sure that Chuck Schumer is not having a hearing for anyone. You'll say, you know what, payback. And we may have an empty seat now. I've been talking about this empty seat for a couple of years. I've called the Clint Eastwood effect, right, with the empty chair. Before Scalia dies, like, this is going to happen. It'll happen sooner or later, where we're going to have a position where no one's going to confirm for a while. And indeed, you're actually seeing some people like Eric Siegel at Georgia State say 8 is enough. And then my good friend Ilya Shapiro, Cato, saying, don't confirm anyone, right? And now Ted Cruz is saying this, and then Burr in North Carolina is saying it. I want to take a step back and think about this for a moment. The reason why the Supreme Court is getting all this attention is because it's so damn important. Why is the Supreme Court so important? Because it is the most important thing a president will do. Long after President Reagan's gone, we still have Kennedy deciding the world's fate, right? Long after Clinton's gone, we still have Ginsburg and Breyer. If you ask most people what's the single most important thing a president does, they'll say SCOTUS. That is awful, right? A decision which cannot be reversed, that's only subject to a single vote at a single point in time with a majority of senators, defines the fate of a republic for decades. That is a scary thought. And for those who actually care about democracy, it's really troubling. So it doesn't surprise me at all that this process has been so damn politicized for the precise reason that's become so critical. That's why my advice before consenting may actually bring more deliberation and make more collaboration, that this should not be a uniform decision. Mr. Fry.
Yeah, I just a question. I was wondering if you could.
Only he can jump in, but he's
interested to hear your thoughts on this.
Brian's a good friend, always.
It strikes me that the closest analog to the situation we see right now is the Fortas nomination.
Oh, good. You want to tell us about the Fortas nomination?
Sure. So, Lyndon Johnson nominated then Associate Justice Abe Fortas to replace Chief Justice Warren.
Well, because he's being elevated, yeah.
Who had announced that he was going to retire as soon as his replacement was appointed and confirmed, which was of questionable legitimacy in the first place. But regardless, this was as Johnson had announced that he was not going to be running for re-election. So it was an open question whether the Democrats and the Republicans were going to win in '68. And the Republicans were pretty confident that Nixon was going to win. And so they refused to, effectively, they held hearings, but refused to confirm Justice Fortas's elevation to Chief Justice and the subsequent replacement of him as Associate Justice. But what was interesting about it politically to me in '68 was that the Republicans seemed to feel at that point in time that they needed to have a reason to oppose Fortas. They couldn't just do it as a naked political, we don't have to, so we won't kind of thing. They held pretty extensive hearings and felt like they had to identify like legitimate substantive reasons for opposing the nomination in the first place and really cast around and look for a lot of stuff. It's been interesting to me to see this year that it doesn't seem like anyone has felt the obligation to do that at all.
No.
And what do you think changed?
Right. So let me put it this way, right? This is 100% politics. And Professor Douglas walked in a minute ago. We're talking about the decision of McConnell, after removing this from his name, to not hold any sort of hearings or anything. It's politics all the way down, right? But there's nothing wrong with politics. In fact, the Constitution textually commits this to the Senate as a purely political decision. You can talk about whether this has effects on institutions and maybe screws things up in the future, sure. But this is a purely political decision. And Professor Fry is a good friend and knows a lot about Nixon, right? He's exactly on point, right? There was an effort to explain why are we not holding a hearing for this guy Borders, right? Why are we holding? There was some corruption going on. He alluded to it, but there was some really shady stuff.
But they didn't know about that.
They did not know at the time. Oh, they probably maybe they knew. They maybe knew. These are like
prove it at the time.
These are like the FBI agents who know about the Clinton Foundation, but they don't know. They only know. But that's the situation we present ourselves in. So even if whoever wins next week, Clinton or Trump, or God willing, if Josh has its, if there's a disputed recount, Professor Douglas will be up to his ears the next 3 months. He's class is canceled, right?
Not funny.
Go read Nate Silver. There are so many states within the margin of error now that are actually within the statistical margin of error for a recount. Well, some states have a mandatory recount that's within a certain margin. Florida's in that margin, so Josh may have a fun fall. But let's go back to the actual topic at hand, right? That's what's going to happen next year. Let's talk about actually case law. Not about politics, but case law. What are some of the cases that may be at risk, depending on who the next justice is? So this term, we're already seeing the manifestation of Justice Scalia's absence in a very odd sense. The Supreme Court granted certiorari in a case called Trinity Lutheran, which discusses whether a church that has a playground can apply for a grant to get these rubber chips. These rubber chips in a playground so kids don't crack their skulls? Yeah, good idea, right? So this church had a daycare at the playground. They applied for these rubber chips, and the state said, no, we can't do it because that's a violation of the state constitution and establishment. The court granted certiorari before Scalia passed away. Okay, that was like a year ago. The case is still pending. They haven't scheduled for argument yet. It's fully briefed. Everything's ready to roll, but the court is deliberately not scheduling for argument. I think this is a manifestation of saying, well, we're probably split 4-4 on this one. Indeed, last year the court split 4-4 in a huge case, the U.S. v. Texas immigration case, whether President Obama's executive action was lawful. Another case which wasn't 4-4 but could have been was the contraceptive mandate case. In that situation, the justices couldn't really reach a decision on how to resolve the Little Sisters of the Poor and whether they could be, whether their plan could be used to provide contraception. So they said, well, we won't split 4-4. We'll simply say, go guys, figure it out. Go give another shot at it, which was a weird decision. But already this year, we have other cases granted that will face a full court probably. One case involving the Slants. This is an Asian rock band that tried to copyright their name, the Slants. The Patent and Trademark Office declined their trademark because they said, their copyright, because they said it's offensive. And they said, well, we have a First Amendment right to be offensive. Another case was actually granted last week. This is a biggie. This is Gloucester County versus GG. This is whether Title IX of the federal law prohibits discrimination on the basis of gender identity in the context of bathrooms, and whether a school can decline access to a person based on their gender identification. There's a couple other big cases coming up. One is the Clean Power Plan. This is President Obama's core environmental agenda of whether he can regulate various carbon emitters using the Clean Air Act. And there is a massive DC Circuit case about this. This will come up. Another case coming up is involving net neutrality. This is the idea of whether you can take this 1930s era telecommunications law and use it to regulate Comcast as if it was a common carrier, right? The same law which regulated big AT&T back in the day, can we use this to regulate Comcast and Verizon to ensure that they don't charge more to certain customers than others, what's called paid prioritization. These are very significant cases. But this is in the short term, right? Let's go a little bit longer. What sort of cases may be on the chopping block depending on whether you have a Clinton appointment or a Trump appointment? The first case, which I'm sure Josh will talk about, is Citizens United. You may have heard of it. Hillary Clinton has made a point of saying on 5 or 6 occasions that if she appoints a justice, it'll be someone who reverses Citizens United. Okay, these litmus tests are very problematic because, again, if a justice says, I will reverse case X, they have to recuse from that case. But it's not necessary for them to say that because we all know what Hillary Clinton wants in a justice. And indeed, we have already 4 justices willing to say that Citizens United was wrong. There was a case, the Montana case from a couple of years ago. The court did not grant certiorari, but there was a separate opinion from Breyer, Ginsburg, Sotomayor, and Kagan, where they said, yeah, we still think this case was wrong, and they probably vote to reverse it. So if there's a fifth vote to reverse this united, it's probably going away. How will this come up? No federal law will be passed, but maybe a state will pass a law banning some form of independent expenditures. That tees up the challenge, and I think the Supreme Court would probably reverse it since united. Another precedent that may be on the chopping block, but not quite as much, is District of Columbia v. Heller, a case you're probably familiar with. This was a 2008 decision guaranteeing a right to an individual right to keep and bear arms under the Second Amendment. This was a 5-4 case, and it's been very unpopular in a lot of quarters. Now, I don't think, contrary to what Mr. Trump says, Heller is much at risk of being overturned. Why? Because Heller doesn't do that much. Right? All Heller did was it said, in your home, you have the right to a handgun. And since Heller and McDonald 2010, the court has not taken any Second Amendment cases. And uniformly, much to my consternation, the courts of appeals have basically said that's all Heller says. It doesn't apply to concealed carry. It doesn't apply to having an AR-15. It doesn't apply to a host of sorts of things that maybe gun owners would want to have. So the case had very limited salience. So the court doesn't need to overturn Heller. All they have to say is this decision applies only to handguns in the home, period, at which point it's a dead letter because the only places that had handgun bans, DC and Chicago, have no longer, so the case would have no more impact. Another area that I think is ripe for review is administrative law. There's been movements afoot to pare back what are known as the Auer and Chevron doctrines, whether courts will defer to agencies that interpret statutes in kooky ways, but they'll simply defer because it's not absolutely insane. If Scalia's replacement is a conservative, I think these doctrines will be pared back because it's a way of fighting the administrative state. If it's a Clinton nominee, I think these doctrines will become stronger, and because we don't pass laws anymore, simply administrative agencies will make all sorts of policies and courts will simply follow them. Okay, let's move on to the longer term. And this is what we'll wrap up with, and you guys can get your lunch after I finish. Is the food here?
Yes.
Okay, so as soon as I'm done, you guys have to eat. Let's move on to the longer term and talk about some of the changes in how things may evolve. So for years, liberals have tried to say keep away, right? Don't bring big cases to the court where you may lose involving maybe labor unions and free speech, keep away. Now conservatives are going to start playing keep away the gun cases, right? Deny this, deny that, keep the Supreme Court away. So this actually brings a lot more power to the regional courts of appeals because we're going to have fewer grants of certiorari on these big cases. What about textualism and originalism? This was Justice Scalia's core contribution to the law. I think you will not necessarily see a decline in how judges are textualists because that's something that I think has been ingrained. But to the extent that there are any originalists in the court, I think there will be a faltering. Justice Thomas is the only other originalist, perhaps even a stronger originalist, and he will probably remain alone in that regard. What else? Voting rights. This is Professor Douglas's expertise. One issue that's been bubbling up a lot is what's called partisan gerrymandering, right? This is not drawing districts based on race or some other factor, but you're trying to make Democrat votes diluted or trying to make Republicans vote diluted. I used to live in Pennsylvania in Jack Murtha's district, and it was this Democratic gerrymandered district that looked like this bolt of lightning. Like it was like 20-sided this 20-sided polygon, right? Even if it wasn't a racial gerrymander, it's purely meant to preserve a Democratic district. Courts have tried to stay out of that, what's called this thicket, right? This very complicated topic, but we may see a future court be willing to address this. Justice Stevens has hinted at this in a few different places. Another area we may see good change in the law is with the death penalty. Justices Breyer and Ginsburg are now on record saying, we don't think the death penalty can be constitutionally enforced, period. Sotomayor and Kagan are quiet, maybe they're playing strategic, but we may see efforts to bring a full frontal challenge to death penalty. This is probably not going to happen because a more likely scenario is the court erects so many barriers to actually executing someone that it dies by attrition, no pun intended. I mean, if you think about it, right, they're saying, oh, they're using these horrible drugs to execute these people. States have assisted suicide. There are drugs where you can kill someone very painlessly, but the pharmaceutical companies won't sell them to states because they don't like the execution. So they basically erected, through social agendas and social movements and court orders, they made it almost impossible to execute someone well. So this simply may fade away as support for the death penalty fades. So I don't think the death penalty is too much longer for this world. No pun intended again. But we have that. One final note is on what are often called positive rights. Now, what is a positive right? Our Constitution speaks of negative rights. Congress can't do this. Congress can't do that. They can't violate your speech. They can't violate your guns, right? They can't search yourself without a warrant. But we don't have in our Constitution a right to stuff, right? The Constitution doesn't say you have the right to health care. Thank God, right? I have to write another book about that. You have the right to, you have the right to housing, right? If you read some foreign constitutions, they have these positive rights. Instead, state constitutions have similar provisions. One thing that's bubbling up is a right to education. That if a school district is not providing adequate opportunities for education, they're saying, well, that violates the 14th Amendment. And as a result, courts have the power to supervise school budgets. These suits are being filed all over the place. And this would be a huge decision because it would basically give courts, supervisory power over school budgets. And if you want to see how crazy it is, go to New Jersey. Or a couple of years ago, the New Jersey Supreme Court actually vetoed the state's budget, right? Chris Christie and the Democrats actually agreed on a school budget, and the Supreme Court basically vetoed it, which is stunning. But I think you're seeing these sorts of movements afoot. So in short, and I'll let you guys get your lunch in a minute, we're going to see a lot of changes in the court in the short term and in the long term, but a lot of it depends on what happens in, 5 days or in January 20th, whenever we get an inauguration, right? Whenever we actually have a president crowned or saluted or whatever, the gilded, whatever, we'll know what's going to happen. But there are strong changes afoot. Thank you so much, and go get your lunch. We'll reconvene at 12:30. Thank you. And don't leave. Actually, come back. If you leave, I'll be very upset. Yeah. Yeah, come after it. Hey, John. Thanks for doubling up. Thanks for doubling up. Appreciate it. 2 or 3 things. I mean, he's showing despite all the. Yeah, I had to drive. What a game. I had to drive this 7-hour drive. No cell phone service. Fortunately, between Columbia and Louisville, there's absence. I guess also I'm right. It never actually had that happen. I got camps out of Columbia, so I can drive. I left the car. Bad weather in Chicago. I just want to say, hey, I'm Chris Bradley. I know you have a lot of. You do, yeah. I was wondering where you that's a good question. I don't know, actually. Yeah, we'll say, did they come out with a new name now? The court ruled against them? It's going to be. The court will be calling meetings. I'll check. Oh, you don't even know?
No, we definitely did. I'm
Yeah.
They did a
good job representing us. Jeremy, doing the case you got. David actually did a very good job. Chad didn't do that case, but I know Chad's wife. So, of course, yeah. So are you tired? So we're close. What time were you able to come down? I'm not. I'm a super. I'm not a Cubs fan or anything. I'm just a big baseball fan, but it's pretty awesome.
I think that was an amazing game.
You're the best part.
This guy turned it off at the end of the 9th inning. Yeah, I'm ratting you out.
All right, Josh.
How you did it? How did you did it?
Have I mentioned that the kid wakes up at 7 a.m.?
So does
She doesn't
mine.
care about the game.
So does mine.
She's like, mommy, 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 mommy. So
yeah, I had to get my kid into school on time today.
all right, how does she go?
To be there at 7:45.
All right, everyone, settle down. We're going to start our show.
I'm gonna say we.
All right, so thanks for having me, for letting me do a response or commentary, whatever you want to call it, to Professor Blackman. I don't think anything he said was controversial. I pretty much agree with everything he said in terms of reading the tea leaves of what might happen with the new justice. So what I thought I'd do instead is focus in a little bit more on my area of expertise, which is election law, and provide a couple of examples of where I think a new justice, whenever we get one, will be really, really significant. Now, whether that's a new Justice Merrick Garland during the lame duck Congress, I don't know if that is likely if Hillary Clinton wins, or if we need to wait, or maybe we won't have a new justice for 4 years. Some Republicans have said under a Clinton presidency they're not going to allow anyone to get through. But either way, at some point, I would think we'll have a ninth justice. And I think it will affect election law doctrine, which is actually at an early stage of its development. I mean, election law wasn't really a thing until, as its own separate body, really Bush v. Gore in 2000 was what made election law a thing, although there are a handful of cases before that. So I want to talk about just a couple areas of election law doctrine that I think a new justice could have a really big impact. And those areas are redistricting, the Voting Rights Act, voter ID / the right to vote, and post-election disputes, the Bush v. Gore. So I'll just talk on those 4 briefly, and then hopefully we can have a conversation. So first, redistricting, and Josh mentioned this a little bit, but I think there's 2 areas of redistricting where we may see some significant changes. One that he mentioned is partisan gerrymandering. In a case called Veith in 2003, the court ruled 5-4 that courts should not hear claims of partisan gerrymandering, that there are no judicially manageable standards. Courts can't figure out when using politics has been too much, because all drawing lines, according to the court, involves some political calculations. And so how do we know when that's gone too far? And that was the opinion was written by Justice Scalia. I said 5-4. It's actually a 4-1-4. Justice Scalia, for the 4 so-called conservatives, said no, this is non-justiciable and there's no manageable standards. The 4 so-called liberals each came up with their own standard to say, here's a standard courts can use, and courts are able to apply them. And the Justice Kennedy in the middle kind of said, well, I don't like saying there's no standard out there ever, but I'm not really smart enough to come up with one by myself. So I'm just going to punt, and maybe someday there will be a standard that someone creates that I can't figure out. So he didn't vote with either side. He left the door open to having a standard. Well, there's a couple cases percolating right now in the court systems. One is in Wisconsin, partisan gerrymandering claim brought by the Democrats, and they're using this new political science theory called the efficiency gap. And so far, the lower courts have said, yeah, the efficiency gap is something we can measure, and judges can take judicial notice of and figure out whether the efficiency gap is too large. I won't go into the details of how it works, but whether the efficiency gap is too large such that the map is unlawful. In Maryland, this is a case brought by the Republicans saying that the Democrats gerrymandered improperly, and they're using a theory of under the First Amendment right to association, which is the exact thing that Justice Kennedy suggested in his concurrence when he said, I can't come up with a standard. He said, but maybe the First Amendment gives us a good standard. So I do think a new justice, especially one appointed by President Hillary Clinton, would agree with the others that one of these standards makes sense and that courts can re-enter the political thicket, so-called political thicket, on partisan gerrymandering claims. The other redistricting area that I think we'll see some movement on is on racial gerrymandering. And the courts already have been striking down various maps, particularly in North Carolina and Alabama, for improper racial gerrymanders. So I'm not sure that'll be a change so much, but I think a continuation of some of that doctrine. On the Voting Rights Act, the key case from 2013 is Shelby County versus Holder, which was a challenge to the Voting Rights Act provision that certain so-called covered jurisdictions, certain states and localities had to obtain federal approval for any new election laws before they go into force. So if you are Texas and you want to implement a voter ID law, or if you're a county in Texas and you want to move your polling place from one spot to another spot, before you could do that, you have to get approval from the federal government, and you have to say that this change does not have the effect or there's no intent or effect of discriminating on the basis of race, making minority voters worse off. The court struck that down in 2013, saying things like times have changed, and the biggest question was the coverage formula. Who is covered? Which state should be covered under this formula? Because Kentucky's not covered. Ohio, which is the site of a lot of voting disputes, is not covered. But Texas, Alabama, et cetera, were. Alaska, because of the Native American population. Parts of New York, because the minority voters and language minorities live there. And so the court said, basically, look, the coverage formula is outdated. So if you want to have this kind of pre-clearance mechanism, Congress at least need to update the coverage formula. There was a very strong dissent from Justice Ginsburg, who basically used an analogy that said, just because it's pouring rain, just because, what was the exact analogy? Josh, do you remember?
It's like saying you don't need an umbrella because it stopped raining.
Yeah, it stopped raining, so you don't need an umbrella anymore, right? Well, of course, it might rain, so you might need an umbrella. That was her analysis, basically, was that, look, just because there aren't as many overt forms of racial discrimination, it doesn't mean that this pre-clearance mechanism is not providing a deterrent effect. I think a new justice, especially one appointed by Hillary Clinton, would view this the rules involving the Voting Rights Act much more consistently with the Ginsburg view as opposed to the Chief Justice Roberts view. And so if Congress were to create a new coverage formula, or if another provision of the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, which applies nationwide, were to be challenged, I think there are challenges percolating, then I think a court with a Hillary Clinton appointed justice is more likely to uphold the law. A court with Donald Trump appointed justice more likely to strike down other parts of the Voting Rights Act. The third area I was going to talk about was kind of voter ID / right to vote. Here we have a long line of cases in which, in my view, the court has been way too deferential to states in the compelling interest prong of the constitutional test. So those of you who are not taking constitutional law, basically when you challenge a law under the U.S. Constitution, you say you have to demonstrate that the state doesn't have a good enough interest for the law, depending on the level of scrutiny, how strong the interest needs to be, but either a rational basis or a compelling interest. And you have to demonstrate that the means that the state has chosen are not tailored sufficiently to achieving the state's goals. And in my view, the court has been way too deferential on that first prong, on the state's interest. Basically, the state says something like, well, we're trying to preserve election integrity, trying to preserve the electoral process. The court has said, yeah, that's fine, that makes sense. And so it's led to, in my view, a lower level of scrutiny, which is inappropriate for something as important as a constitutional right to vote. The 2008 case of Crawford versus Marion County Election Board, which refused to strike down Indiana's voter ID law, kind of had this mentality where the court said, yeah, Indiana, we're gonna trust you that your voter ID law is intended to root out in-person impersonation or voter fraud. I think a new justice might look more skeptically at a state's justifications for a law that might impact the constitutional right to vote. So I think we could see a more robust protection like we had in the 60s for the constitutional right to vote. And the final area I'll mention, and then hopefully we'll have time for some discussion and questions, is what happens in the Trump versus Clinton scenario at the Supreme Court, what I've referred to in the press as the nightmare scenario. Imagine it goes this way: Florida is disputed, or North Carolina, or Pennsylvania, pick your
or all the above,
or all of the above. And Trump, of course, has indicated he's not going to back down quietly. So I think the likelihood of him bringing a challenge is pretty high. The challenge we brought in the state tribunal system. It depends on the state. Some states, like Florida, use the state courts. Other states, like North Carolina, you have to go through the Board of Elections first before you can go to the courts. Other states, Colorado, for example, would go to the state Supreme Court initially. So states have their own mechanisms for how to resolve these things. But imagine this percolates up and we get into a Bush v. Gore type situation. Well, we have 8 justices right now. And so then imagine that the court splits and whatever the legal issue is, 4-4.
You think John Roberts actually likes Trump?
No, but I'm imagining a scenario in which the court has to take it. So here's my nightmare scenario to get a little more detailed and legal here. Let's imagine there's disputed provisional ballots. Provisional ballots are just a public service announcement. If you go to the polls and your name's not on the rolls, or you don't have the form of whatever they're asking you to show, or something problem, do not be turned away. You're under federal law, you have to be offered a provisional ballot. Basically, you fill out the provisional ballot, they'll set it aside, and we'll figure out after Election Day whether it counted or not. So don't let anyone turn you away from the polls without casting a ballot, unless you're actually at the wrong precinct, and then go to your right precinct and then cast. States are not legally required to cast provisional ballots cast at the wrong precinct. But so let's assume there's a dispute about provisional ballots. Let's say in Ohio, The state says we're not going to count provisional ballots if the signature is on the right-hand side of the envelope when the provisional ballot envelope says you have to put it on the left-hand side. Okay, which is something that states have done, right? It says, you have to comply with the rules strictly, and so it says signature's got to be here, and it's not. Let's say North Carolina has the exact same issue, but North Carolina says, yeah, we are going to count these provisional ballots, because it's not a big deal. Just because you signed on the wrong spot, not a huge issue. All right, so now you've got disputes in both states. The state Supreme Courts have ruled the opposite way on how to deal with provisional ballots involving the exact same issue. The court's got to take that, right? You can't, if you're John Roberts, I think you have to resolve that, because otherwise you have different rules for the same presidential election in different states. So I think your implicit comment was John Roberts is going to try to avoid taking this case at all, and so there wouldn't be cert granted. And I think Roberts cares very much about the institutional legitimacy, but I can come up with a scenario.
I think he's voting for Hillary.
Oh, I don't know about that, but I'm just saying I think Roberts will care most about the institutional legitimacy of the court. So I think he's going to try to stay out of it. I think he's going to try to avoid the 4-4 situation. But I can come up with a scenario in which it's basically impossible not to do so. Now, what happens on a 4-4? Well, it's a basic affirmance of the lower court. So there's no written opinion. It's a one-line order saying we affirm whatever the lower court said by an equally divided vote. Now, recall where this case would have come from. Most likely a state Supreme Court. And how are state Supreme Court justices chosen in 39 states? Elected. And some of those, they're actually partisan. So now we have a situation where the presidential election comes down to a decision, in essence a decision by elected, potentially partisan state Supreme Court justices. Like I said, a nightmare scenario. What this means for a new justice is, I think, we're not going to get a new justice before this were to occur, clearly. But I think in terms of how to resolve these last-minute disputes, whichever president gets to appoint them, and I saw that Gary Johnson just came out with his short list of names. Josh was not on it. I was sad to see.
I know if the Randy Barnett is, I'll take that.
Yeah, but I thought, I saw him. I thought maybe you'd be on the list.
I'm on the circuit court list,
Farm team, the farm team, yeah. So whoever it is, I think will have a huge impact on the next electoral meltdown. 2000, we've had, however 50 some odd presidential elections. We've had some sort of dispute about those in, I think, 5 or 6 of them going through history. 1876, 1824, 1960, 2000. So, and I forgot 1800, of course. Anyone who's listened to the musical Hamilton will know about that one, the musical Hamilton. So at least 5 have come down to some sort of dispute. We're going to get another one of these. And so I think it's very dangerous, especially in the current environment, if we have the possibility of a 4-4 split. I know this isn't on topic, but let me just give you one more nightmare scenario, and then we can open up the questions. Let's say neither candidate gets 270 electoral votes. Let's say Evan McMullin wins Utah, for example. So neither candidate gets 270. It gets thrown to the House of Representatives to choose the next president among the top 3 vote recipients from the top 3 people who won electoral college votes. States vote by delegation, right? So each state gets 1 vote as to who should become the next president. And in Kentucky, right now at least, you have 5 Republicans and 1 Democrat. So in theory, those 5 would vote together to choose the Republican candidate, although who really knows? So there's 2 kind of constitutional crises here that occur. One's not as much of a constitutional crisis. Let's say Kentucky's delegation splits 3-3. Well, they just wouldn't get a vote. They would deadlock, so they wouldn't have a vote. Their vote wouldn't count. But let's imagine that all 50 states can come up with a decision on who to vote for, and it splits 25-25. The Constitution doesn't tell us what to do.
Vice President Kane.
Well, yeah, because no one. So it would be President Kane in that situation, or President Pence, because no one would win the presidential election, but the Senate would, in theory, choose. Of course, what happens if the Senate splits?
Biden break the tie?
I guess he probably could. Yeah. So I guess, do we have a mechanism for the Senate? But my point is, that's a constitutional crisis. Likely to happen? Probably not. But it's possible that there's 25-25 vote in the House of Representatives to decide the next president, and no one knows what to do. All right. We have about 10 minutes or so.
I have a question for Josh, if I can, because you're very fortunate here at Kentucky, one of the leading national experts on election law. You're very, very fortunate. Josh, what happens if during this, say tie is 269-269, which is mathematically possible, it can happen because of the way that the electoral votes shift. Josh, what happens if some people in the electoral college decide to vote differently? Like, so let's say the so-called faithless elector, right? So you have someone who is a Republican elector, screw this, vote for Hillary, or you have a Democrat saying screw this and vote for Trump.
Yeah.
What happens then?
So it depends on the state. Some states have a law that says electors are required to vote for the candidate who their state popular vote voted for, and some states like Kentucky do not have that law. So if it happens in Kentucky for the faithless elector, nothing happens, right? That person gets to vote for whoever they want. They are selected, they're going to be their own political ramifications for that person. They're chosen by the party leaders, and so they're going to have to own up to what they did. But they get to cast an electoral college vote whoever they want. Interesting question, I think, is in the states that actually have laws that require the electors to vote consistent with how their state voted. And there'll be a constitutional challenge. And I think there's very good arguments, although I'm not sure how it would come out. I think there are strong arguments to say that a law requiring electors to vote how the state votes is unconstitutional. And so that's another kind of really interesting, and there's not a lot of time, because between you cast your electoral college votes on December 12th, I believe it is, they get sent to Congress, I think, on the 18th, or maybe I'm getting these backwards. I think the 9th, I'm sorry, this year I think they cast them on the 19th.
Yeah, that's right.
And they get to send to Congress, and Congress counts them on January 6th. So not a lot of time between December 18th and January 6th to figure this whole thing out.
Yeah, and there's a decent argument that the First Amendment guarantees a right to vote to whomever you choose. I think I agree with Josh. These laws are probably not constitutional.
Well, and I think Article 2 also suggests that Article 2, which sets up the Electoral College, suggests that the electors can do whatever they want.
Well, the states can set the qualifications, but that's to be an elector. There's an argument, by the way. Let's go to some questions from the students, because there's a lot we've covered. Yes, sir, in the back.
So I'm an out-of-state student here, but I just read my registered to vote here in Kentucky. Does my home state of Alabama know that I've changed my registration? And could I hypothetically vote twice?
I'll let Josh handle this one.
So hypothetically, yes, you could. However, the likelihood, there's two reasons why you probably wouldn't do that, is my guess. Is one, the likelihood that you get caught is somewhat high because people are watching for this sort of thing. But then two, the reason for doing so is absurd. You're not going to change the election, right? You need a whole lot of you.
Every
to do
vote
that.
counts, Josh. Every vote
Of course it does. But you need a whole lot of you to do that to make a difference. So, Trump has been on this election rigging. The election's going to be rigged. No, it's impossible for a presidential election. Voter fraud exists some, typically through absentee balloting, not through impersonation or voting multiple times. And studies to show that just doesn't happen. But where it does through absentee balloting is usually in local elections, because those you can swing by a handful of votes. To rig a presidential election, the number of people you would need to do that is mind-boggling.
Yes, in the back.
My question is more about this nomination in general, but dating back to Justice Scalia's nomination and now to Justice Carlin's, and not the last 11 justices who have been nominated have been sitting on federal. Do you guys think this is a good thing? That it's like essentially affecting our
So the question, if you couldn't hear it, was virtually all the recent justices have come from federal courts of appeals. Is that a good idea? I would like some diversity of thought. One of the reasons why I like Trump's list, and I don't like Trump, I like his list, is he looked at state Supreme Courts.
It's not his list, it's Cato's list, right?
Oh, Heritage Foundation.
Right, but I mean, let's get real, he gave him a list. Mitch McConnell helped out.
His name's on the building, he didn't build it, yeah. He didn't build the wall. So the short answer, I think we should look more to the state Supreme Courts for people who can be on the U.S. Supreme Court. I think people have a great reflection of federalism, and also, as Josh said, a lot of the state Supreme Court justices were elected, and you develop certain skills from being a politician that may actually be useful. As far as a constitutional scholar, I would wholeheartedly recommend Randy Barnett for the Supreme Court. I don't think that's going to happen, but I think you can get people with intellectual heft who can actually develop law in a favorable direction.
let me answer that question just slightly differently. I mean, I agree largely with what Josh said, but I'd also like to see diversity of regions and schools that people went to. Because
UKY,
now, sure, I think we have some great students and alums that would be good. Right now, you have basically most of the justices went to Harvard. I think all went to Harvard, Yale. I guess Ginsburg had some time at Columbia, and they're all basically from the East Coast.
Except for Kennedy, but California doesn't count.
Yeah, or the West Coast, right? Yeah. So I think I would like to see some regional and educational diversity in addition to the other kinds of diversity that we're talking about.
There were previously justices from 4 of the 5 boroughs in New York. I am from Staten Island, the unclaimed justice, so I will gladly fill that role. Another question, please. Yes, sir.
For Professor Douglas, how likely do you think the scenario that Professor Blackman described of the empty seat continuing on in the event of a Republican president would actually happen?
So if Trump wins or McMullen, I guess.
Yeah. And the Senate just refused. How likely do you see that?
And we're assuming that the Senate it turns Democrat. I think ultimately cooler heads will prevail no matter who wins the presidency and the Senate. I would predict a 9th justice by the end of 2017 because I think in the heat of this election season, we've gotten kind of crazy rhetoric, but my guess is that cooler heads would prevail.
I think the 2020 campaign begins on January 21st.
It might.
I think Ted Cruz will be in Iowa after Election Day.
Well, anyone who watched the Cubs game last night, didn't it look Ted Cruz was the owner of the Cubs? I'm like, how's Ted Cruz up there winning with the World Series trophy?
Well, Justice Stevens was there. Someone who hasn't asked a question yet. New questioner, please. If I'll go back to him. Anyone else? All right, go round 2.
If it's so 69, Clinton's White House would actually be the most likely.
It wouldn't be a Clinton-Pence, though. I mean,
the Senate.
Well, oh, you're saying so that, but then the House would have to turn Democrat, which is probably not going to happen. Yeah.
If McMullen wins Utah, I think a lot of people may, but like Utah would probably.
The other Republican states would vote McMullen, you think, is what you're saying?
I mean, I've looked at math, maybe Josh can correct me. There are enough, because of gerrymandering, there are enough Republican delegations that it probably won't tie 55. I think there'll be enough there'll be at least 26 states that, I mean, look, Wyoming has 1 vote. California has 1 vote. That's insane, right? That's insane, but that's our constitutional structure.
Right, but I think the premise of the question is, let's say some of the Republican delegations vote McMullen and some of them vote Trump. So Clinton actually comes out.
It would only be Utah, and I think there's still enough Republican states. But yeah, in theory, if it's Utah is a 26th state, I think they may be persuaded to change their mind at that point. In other words, I don't think the House is throwing this to Clinton. I think the House will prevail. I mean, you go back to the election of 1800. How many disputed ballots were there? Like 30-something. Yeah. I mean, I think the reason why in the final ballot, that some guy from Delaware was promised like a Coast Guard position or something. Like basically, President Jefferson promised the guy from Delaware like some position as like a lighthouse. Anyway, I think we're out of time. Thank you all so much. And questions?
Were you live on somewhere right now?
Yeah, we're live streaming. Say hi.
Hi everyone. Live streaming to whom? YouTube. To all your followers.
Well, we have 1 viewer at the moment, but maybe other people are trying on.
Hi viewer.
Yeah. Hey.